各位朋友，大家晚上好啊！欢迎各位参加由 MentoringCo 导师学院以及组织隐形技能管理全球智库叫 GO-TKM 联合举办的组织隐形技能管理大师课堂讲座。那么这个系列讲座呢，我们总共组织了50场，今天晚上讲的是第10场。那今天晚上的演讲嘉宾呢，是由来自美国哥伦比亚大学的 Katrina 教授，他给大家来分享。那分享的主题呢，是叫组织隐形技能管理的秘籍，有知识分享的画中画。那么在我们开始之前呢，让我们首先来认识一下我们今天晚上的演讲嘉宾。那么今天晚上的演讲嘉宾呢，是我们来自于美国哥伦比亚大学 Katrina 教授，他呢以前呢是来自于最早以前呢是麻省理工的 MBA， 是 Maine 大学的哲学博士啊。然后呢，他现在是 Plastic Free Island Network 创始人，也是 Online Consulting 公司的总裁啊。同时呢，他也是哥伦比亚大学教授，曾经为了麻省理工、波士顿和乔治华盛顿大学以及联合国跟美国多个政府机构做过各类的演讲和咨询。他同时呢，也是在曾担任过了IBM。和普华永道、安永、英特尔等高级企业，曾经在摩根大通做副总裁、副的。那么呢，今天晚上的讲座呢，是由 MentoringCo 导师学院组织隐形技能管理全球智库联合主办。那 MentoringCo 是一家总部在比利时布鲁塞尔的全球化导师咨询服务公司，它业务呢遍布全球6大洲35个国家和地区。那我们所有提供的导师技术、培训课程、组织服务流程以及标准以及服务团队均获得欧洲导师教练协会的认证。那 MentoringCo 中国是一家注册在上海的中欧合资企业，2019年11月份首次把欧洲导师教练技术引入中国。那组织隐形技能管理全球智库，它是一家注册在比利时布鲁塞尔的非营利性国际智库，旨在推动组织隐形技能管理在全社会的运用，并推动人类的高效学习。OK， 那么后面呢，我讲呢，把今天的更多时间留给我们的今天的教授演讲嘉宾。Now let's warmly welcome Professor Katrina give us the wonderful speech. Thank you, Katrina. Hand over to you. Just a second.
Thank you very much, Fisher. It is a joy to be here, and greetings from Orono, Maine, where I spend part of my time along with Boston and New York. I'm going to talk about research that I've recently completed, looking at the way we use conversation to create incredible outcomes, not the least of which is co-creation. I started in the 90s while I was at MIT. I got the itch to better understand how dialogue can improve the productivity of groups, and I've been on a 30-year journey to understand that in businesses. I am going to share slides, and then I'm going to turn it over to Icy, who is going to translate into Chinese. Thankfully, she has already translated the slides themselves. So there may be some things that I skip over. And for those of you who are reading Chinese, you have copies of the slides. For those of you who want to read the English, please go ahead and reach out to me on LinkedIn or elsewhere. We're friends. I would be delighted to share the slides with you in English. I'm going to share my screen, and here we go.
好，大家晚上好，非常高兴今天能给大家做这场讲座。我来自美国，然后我居住的地方呢离波士顿、纽约很近。今天我探讨的主题呢，也是我做了很长时间的研究，是关于对话，是衡量对话对企业责任感、创新和凝聚力的影响。那这个研究呢，其实要追溯到大概90年代，我当时还是在麻省理工的时候，那个时候我开始就做了关于对话的研究，比如对话它对这组织里那个生产率提高的影响。那今天呢，我会有英文的分享，也有中文的分享。那大家呢，不管是英文的还是中文的，都会拿到这个 PPT。
Thank you, Icy. So we're going to talk today about conversation writ large and research that I've undertaken to decompose conversation and see its impacts on accountability, innovation, and relationship building. I'm going to take you through the research that directly looked at aquaculture, which is a sustainability area deeply connected to Maine. I did 3 parts of this research. Some of it was directly looking at community conversations. Some of it was diving into a team's strategic planning endeavors. And then last, I looked at the engagement of those same materials using machine learning to be able to show statistically significant connections between features in conversation and outcomes. So I'm going to switch over to these other slides so that way, when Icy is speaking, she's looking at my slides as well. Icy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. 今天呢，我们主要要跟大家分享以下内容。首先呢，我会就是分解一下对话的原则，然后以及对话它对比如说关系的建立以及对凝聚力的影响。然后呢，我们会看就是3段研究，这3段研究主要是针对持续性对话的影响。那首先呢，我会以缅因州的水产养殖业为例来分析团体的对话数据。然后第二部分我会跟大家分享团队的战略对话。然后接着呢，我会通过人工智能机器学习模型以及对话产生的影响，来帮助大家更好的了解这个对话的它的带来的影响。最后呢，这里也是就是通过各种各样的模型和数据，然后让大家了解这个对话它对就是对话与这个讨论原则的一个关系。那接下来呢，我们来详细看一下。
Fantastic, thank you. So here's what we're going to cover. From a research perspective, many of us have recently read about how we are biologically inclined to collaborate. And the research on the way that different groups come together to address social and ecological problems is pointing to the fact that reputation management and reciprocity are deeply embedded into our human DNA, and that cooperation is an ecologically stable state. Importantly, that research integrates the work of many game theorists and shows that there are also game theoretic stable approaches to engagement that are collaborative. Surprising, because we think that everybody would be in deep competition. And importantly, recently, many organizations have been starting to use AI to better understand collaboration. My research was saying, okay, so if individuals are naturally collaborative, and if that is a stable system, are there ways that we can implement collaborative actions every single moment we're interacting with other humans? What are the actual inputs to language that make it so that we end up with innovation, relationships, resilience, and commitment to action?
那就是在分享我们今天的关于对话的之前呢，我们首先来就是看一下相关的背景研究。首先是社会生态系统研究。那我们知道就是现在大家其实都会关注到这个很多的社会问题以及生态问题。我们知道信誉管理像互惠，这其实是根植于人类的 DNA 的，是属于人类在生态上的稳定的行为。同时我们也关注了很多的心理学博弈理论，然后发现里面就是一些人类的相关行为，包括顺应规范以及可观察性，都会影响到人类的行为，包括就是人类的比如竞争之类的竞争与合作。然后呢是关于人工智能计算机语言学的研究。因为很多组织呢现在都会用到人工智能，然后帮助大家理解如何更好的合作。那因为其实合作其实是个人之间其实可以自然而然产生的连接，其实是可以是属于稳定的系统的行为。但实际情况下呢，其实是我们遇到了很多的阻碍。比如说语言上它可以产生助力，也可以形成阻碍，主要是看我们如何是使用语言的，我们是如何通过语言然后促进我们组织的创造力，然后促进人与人间的关系、复原力等等。
Thank you, Icy. So now I am going to talk a little bit more about the conversation model. Many of you who know me know that I had my original training on conversation while I was at MIT, and I was studying with Bill Isaacs, who is part of the Organizational Learning Center. At that time, they were looking at features of conversation, or shall I say dialogue, that were conducive to creating higher levels of knowledge, generative thinking, innovation. These 4 disciplines, or shall I say practices of dialogue, inspired me to do work in the space of tacit knowledge sharing using conversation. But what I discovered when I got to Columbia was that when we were working in online settings, we had to also focus on how can we use the asynchronous model to bring in people, to ask questions, and to push the ball forward by translating and synthesizing. As you can see here, this original model was talking about how we have our authentic voice in dialogue, how we learn to be supportive of others, of respectful of their origins, and how we learn to suspend and listen. But when we got to the asynchronous interaction at Columbia University, we realized we needed to tweak it. So that's how we ended up with these blue discussion disciplines. Many of you who are on the call have been part of that Columbia journey, and I'm thrilled that you're here. You can see that these discussion disciplines relate to how do we reply, how do we synthesize, how do we mention people, and how do we get the conversation from a bunch of posts playing tennis, if you will, to being generative. So I will show Icy your slide as well.
对，然后这个呢，是我在就是回到大概是90年代的时候，那个时候我在麻省理工，然后当时呢，我跟就是 Isaac 我们2个人是合作进行了关于4种对话实践的研究。那这4种对话实践的研究呢，也是我们在想，就是未来的对话场景应该是怎样的，如何有利于我们促进知识的产生以及分享，如何让我们能够产生战略性的思考，能够去如何创新。那这个当时也给了我很大的激励，也是让我就是能够就是研究更多的关于比如说如何分享隐性知识，是通过对话来实现这个隐性知识的分享。然后后来在哥伦比亚的时候呢，我也继续进行了这样的就是在线对话讨论研究，比如说大家如何更好的去表达自己的观点，向别人提问，然后更好的把你的对话进一步向前推进。然后就像大家看这个图上，比如说有4个方面，比如首先是人应该如何去正确的去表达自己的观点，然后又该如何去支持和尊重别人，然后在别人就是在我们的对话过程当中又要有就是礼貌的停顿，给予别人尊重，然后呢也是要积极的聆听别人的对话，然后最后呢就是又该如何将对话的内容进行整合，也就是总结。后来就是在后面在研究的时候，我们也对这个持续的这个对话进行了一个调整，然后就产生了这样的这个5个这样的一个叫讨论原则，5个讨论原则，这个在哥伦比亚大学期刊上也能够找到。这个几个讨论原则呢，它也是涉及到就是我们如何能够应对别人的问题，别人的观点，我们又如何去来整合别人的观点。比如说我们在线上交流的时候，又比如说去 at 别人，给予别人足够的尊重。
Icy, thank you so much. So the next slide is basically the summary of research that we did while we were at Columbia, trying to see how well the students improved. I won't go on to this slide, but suffice it to say that after they self-assessed on the use of discussion disciplines, they discovered how important they were for developing cohesion in their groups and for learning more quickly. They also used the discussion disciplines while they were working on their team projects. What we saw was that the way that the integrity and courtesy worked with the students had a lot more to do with content, and inclusion and translation, had a lot more to do with affect, and inclusion and translation had a lot more to do with content. And as students advanced, they became more proficient at the discussion disciplines. So this made me think there must be a really interesting, almost biological undercurrent here to this model. So I'm going to just refer to this page for you, Icy, but I'm not reviewing the page.
那这个是我们在就是哥伦比亚大学，然后当时给学生的一个作业，就是让他们用这个讨论原则对自己做一个评估。然后他们当时也就是角色扮演，然后相互对话，然后在就是探索，然后在他们的对话当中是如何运用这个讨论原则的。然后在他们自我评估之后啊，他们发现这个讨论原则就是对他们的凝聚力非常有帮助，而且能够帮助他们更快的学习。然后同时他们也有意识的在团队项目中，然后使用这个对话原则。然后同时呢，我们也发现，就是这几个原则里面的这个真诚礼貌原则，它与这个学生的这个凝聚力是息息相关的。然后这个包容以及这个整合原则呢，它与这个他们对话的内容是紧密相关的。那最后呢，他们也就是非常发现有意思的是，发现这个对话原则它背后的这个逻辑是非常有意思的。然后最后呢，也能就有意识的熟练的运用这些原则。
Thank you, Icy. All right, so this is going to take you into the research that I recently completed. We had a team of folks who were from University of Maine, MIT, and Columbia, who used the aquaculture industry to explore how does conversation play out in environmental conflict. And what we were looking at was ways that we could experience the conversation, code it, and then finally develop a neural net to be able to detect the conversation features, as I said earlier. So I thought it would be helpful for us to start with the definition of sustainable development that really was an undercurrent to all the research that we were doing. And as you can see, sustainable development is about collective enlightenment around the context and integration. It's about working together across difference. I'm going to move over to your slide, Icy.
那这个呢是就是缅因大学，然后 MIT 麻省理工以及哥伦比亚大学，然后有个团队他们做的一个共同的研究，就是主要研究比如说对话对可持续发展性这个的成果的影响。那这里呢，我们主要以缅因州的，然后它的一个水产养殖业，然后为例进行研究。它主要是研究对话对环境冲突带来的影响，就如何通过对话去应对解决这个环境冲突。那首先我们是对这些对话的内容进行了一个编码，然后再做具体分析。在进行这个所有研究之前呢，有一个就是基础，我们是了解一下这个可持续发展的定义。那可持续发展我们是认为它是促进人类包容性的福祉，而且它是建立在对地球的环境、经济和社会资产的开明和综合管理之上的。那也是在这个基础上，大家一起就是求同存异，进行这个比较就是良性的对话。
So you can see that the big headline is that it's integrated and that it's social. This is not just a matter of looking at whether or not we're polluting the local bays or have invasive species. We have much larger questions that we're having to ask if we're getting into aquaculture. So the next slide tells you a little bit about the research. I've already gone through that. And I wanted to tell you about the aquaculture background. This I won't go through in a lot of detail. I think this is a slide that you can read, but suffice it to say that aquaculture represents an opportunity for greater levels of food security, more effective uses of the physical resources and the human resources in Maine. And it also represents a better trade balance for the US. The challenge with aquaculture is that it is sort of a melting pot of many different conflicts. Who is going to have access to the harbors? Who is going to be able to navigate through the harbors? What are the long-standing industries which may now face competition? All of those issues, navigation, biodiversity, aesthetics, came into the conversations that we were evaluating. In fact, every aquaculture farmer is responsible for convening something called a lease scoping meeting. Why these are salient is that they are town halls involving citizens representing all different types of groups, landowners, traditional farmers, traditional fishers, harbor masters who are responsible for managing and controlling the local harbors. Regulators didn't attend the lease scoping meetings, but biologists and others who were concerned about the ecological balance.
那这个呢，其实不只是关于说简单的污染问题，可能对海洋的污染，比如说对周围沙滩港湾的污染，它还涉及到很多的社会生态问题。那当时这个缅因州，这个是缅因州的背景，然后大家可以看一下。那我要强调的是，这个缅因州海水产殖业呢，它是面临着很多的，首先它面临着很多的机遇，比如说对缅因州而言。它比如说在可能食物方面，在比如资源方面，然后有更多的机遇，然后对美国而言也有更多的像粮食安全、贸易平衡这些机遇。那同时也遇到了很多的挑战，这些挑战比如说那些港湾，比如说港湾的使用问题，然后它的长期的生态的一个发展，就它的如何航行、生物多样性，还有美学、通道传统这些问题。我们都探讨到了，然后都是我们就是对话评估的时候，然后考虑到的一个因素。那当时呢，就是大家在这个缅因的这个市政厅，然后举行了一个租赁范围界定会议。这个会议呢，也涉及到了多方，然后比如像这个就是港湾的海港的这个海港局的这个局长，然后还有很多的当时的渔民，然后还有这个土地的所有者，然后也包括当时对这个问题很关心的，像生物学家，大家都就是进行对于这个缅因州这个水产海殖业这些污染问题，然后进行了对话。
Thank you, Icy. So just before I show you the next slide, which is an example of the kinds of coded conversations, one of the things that might be helpful is for me to show you what we meant by these 8 design these different dimensions here, which we call the discussion disciplines. And I'm going to go into the appendix, and people who are going to ask me for these slides will be able to see, you know what, I see this is prettier on yours. This didn't translate into PowerPoint very well. So we have 5 discussion disciplines. The first one, integrity, is about making statements and declarations. Integrity Q is about authentic questions, and that would not be a statement in disguise. The third, courtesy, is about being positive, giving respect. And then inclusion is about acknowledging and recognizing individuals. Inclusion isn't just simply saying, we're going to welcome you. It's also seeing you as an individual. Why is that important? We're going to talk about some statistically relevant direct relationships between that acknowledgement and the intent to act. Last but not least, translation. That is about synthesizing, up-leveling, and summarizing. For those of us who are interested in tacit knowledge, you can immediately see the merits of these. Down at the bottom here, you can't see the graphic, and I will bring it over to Ices, for which the graphics came out nicely. We've got snarky, and that is the opposite of all of those. So maybe the opposite of integrity is sarcasm. Integrity Q might be, as I said before, not really a question, but a statement. And the opposite of courtesy might be criticism or indirect speech. The opposite of inclusion is not recognizing individuals, making general statements when one should really be directing an individual or bringing them in. And then translation, the opposite of translation is just cutting and running and assuming everybody gets it, or being very selective about what one translates. and one picks the information to one's liking. I see I'm going to go right into your appendix too. Here you go. So you guys can see, in the back, we have a write-up of each of these. I'm going to just show you this. See, each one has a write-up about what it is and what it isn't. I see, over to you.
然后刚才呢，我们还提到了一个概念，就是我们在做那个研究分析的时候，首先对对话进行了一个编码。这个对话编码就是非常有助于我们去从不同维度了解这个讨论原则。然后这里我给大家介绍一下这个5大讨论原则。然后第一个是真诚陈述就是意味着你要就是真诚的就表达你自己的观点，或者说你的宣言你是从真实的角度。那第二个呢是真诚 Q 就是也是 question 那个，然后也是说就是要真诚的去提出真实的问题。第三个呢是在对话的时候给予他人礼貌以尊重。那第四个是说包容原则，包容原则就是你要对他人表示认可。这个认可呢，更多的不只是说我们只是欢迎你加入，更多的是对他人，就是这个个人，比如说他的发表的观点也给予认可。第5个是整合，就是对大家的这个关系，对大家的这个对话内容进行可以一个整合提炼，然后也有助于这个大家的对话，然后可以向前进一步。这个整个5个原则呢，它还有一个对立面。有对立的一面呢，就是说，比如说就是礼貌的时候礼貌，那你可能反面就是不礼貌，就是你对话的时候你可能就是用了一些不是那么礼貌的话。那像或者说是你就是说话的时候不那么直接，就是拐弯抹角的跟对方说话。比如说这个包容的另一面就是你可能在就是比如说别人他做了一件就是工作做得很棒，然后你没有说就是非常真诚的去对方就是给予对方这个认可，或者说也没有说能够尊重对方的观点，可能直接就是排斥了对方。比如最后一个整合总结，你可能没有说去完整的很好的去良性的总结，你只是说选择性的去聆听，或者是只挑选那个你喜欢的那些信息部分。
Thank you, Icy. So we're going to go right back to where we were. And this is the slide. I'm going to actually skip that. So, all right. So apologies for the translation because I usually use Google Doc and not PowerPoint. So, all right. In our coding of the conversations, we were looking at specific instances of those discussion disciplines. We coded approximately 750 moves, which really was about 700 utterances by individuals in 7 of these town halls or lease scoping meetings. And I'm not going to read this one. This is a good example of different things that people said. And you can see we have a column here where we identified which of the discussion disciplines they used. And then we talked about the implications of those discussion disciplines on the conversation. I'm just going to draw to your attention this second note here, which was that there was sort of a pivot in this conversation. You could see there was a big emotional dimension to the comment by the harbor master. And the pivots actually had an important impact on the degree to which relationships were being built. We found that quantitatively. It wasn't always evident when you were listening and you felt the tension in the room. So I'm showing it to you, but I'm not going to actually read what's going on here. Icy, go ahead.
我们就是在这个当时的水产养殖会议，它总共进行了7次，然后我们对这7次会议中的750个动态，这个动态也是就是代表这个话语语料，就对这个750个语料进行编码。大家可以看这张图，比如说最右侧的这一栏，我们就是对每一句它每一个话语，然后进行了一个原则分析。比 如说上面真诚、不礼貌、真诚、包容这些。其中大家看一下第二个，比如说不礼貌这一行，因为这一行呢是一个关键点，因为这一行其实是这个港务局长他说话的时候情绪有波动的地方，而这个港务局长他的话呢，其实对这个关系的建立，这些所有人员关系的建立，对这个他们要对话的成果，其实是有着很大影响的。
So we coded the conversations very diligently, and then we did initial statistics. This preceded the creation of the neural net. As you can see in this graphic, there is a distribution of the discussion disciplines. We've also translated them down here. Integrity, which was about making statements, dominated across the board. But you can see there was roughly equal integrity. There were roughly equal integrity, courtesy, inclusion. Integrity Q was slightly more than courtesy and inclusion. And that means that you had more inquiry going on than things that were building affect in the group. And you can see that there were some translating words. Often those came from people in the room, not just simply from the farmer who was trying to build the relationships. And of course, there were some anti or snarky things. 5% of the time, we had sarcasm or indirect speech.
那对这个728个这个语料进行编码以后，然后我们是做了这张图，然后对这个对话中讨论原则的情况进行了一个分布分析。那大家可以看到这张图，真诚的就是陈述事实的这个占比是最大的，就达到了51%。然后在真诚的这个询问、礼貌、包容呢，又差不多就在10%几。然后也看到真诚，然后占比略大于礼貌，然后略大于这个包容。我们也看到就是大家在问题询问方面也是相对比较多的。然后在6%的部分呢，大家是进行整合了，因为当时就是参会的人员也不只是说像渔民他们，也有很多就是相关的其他群体。那最后也看到了，就是大概有50%的时间，这个对话内容里也有一些，比如说讽刺的一部分在里面。
Thank you, I see. Continuing on here, what we found was there were 3 different main outcomes of these conversations, and they correlated with some of those inputs. We're going to get to that in a bit. 3 outcomes were intent to act. That was evidence that someone was going to take an action. It might be the farmer themselves. They might decide they're going to move their aquaculture farm. They might move the oysters. They might move the planned location for the seaweed farm, or it could be somebody else in the group. It might be the harbor master. Here's a quote. The harbor master said, "I will bring it to the attention of the regulators." The second outcome was relationship building. There was evidence that by bringing people together in community, they would come together in a future time and support the aquaculture, or simply support each other as a community. And what you can see here was that we saw evidence of relationship building when there was a delta. There was a change from tension to some kind of positive outcome. And what you see here is the landowner, who would normally be oppositional, supporting the farmer. There was a transition that occurred over the course of the conversation. And then the last outcome is innovation. There were options that were generated by members of the group. You can see that in this example, there were a number of options that were considered for the location of the lease.
然后对这个对话原则进行分布以后呢，我们也同时得出了这个3项对话成果。那第一个成果呢，主要是行动意图。行动意图呢，它也是就是在基于一定的比如说证据基础之上。 那比如说农民，他就是决定要做出一些行动，比如说他可能要把他的这个农场进行搬迁，或者是说让他就是养的那些海鲜那些，然后也把他们比如说移到其他的地方去。那像这里有一个例子，就是港务局长他的话，他说也是他就是在行动上面做的意图，他说我将提请就是海洋资源部的某某人，然后注意此事，这就是他已经有了一个行动的意图。第二个是关于就是关系的建立，因为关系的建立就是说让大家都凝聚在一起，然后共同的为这个水产养殖业的未来然后做出贡献，或者说也是大家就是互相支持的一个结果。那这里呢就有一个比如说土地所有者，他的话语里可以看到他的转变，因为他就是慢慢的就是他开始支持了这个农民，他给予农民一个支持。第三个是形成选项，形成选项就是说大家比如说对比如说某个农场的位置，然后放在哪里，然后大家就是有了一个选择，这个就是选项。
Icy, you're amazing. I can't believe that you remember what I say for that duration. So, as you've heard, we coded for both the inputs, which were the features in the conversation, and the outputs, which were signals in the conversation that were getting people committing to action, building of relationships, and the possibility of new ideas and new directions. So what we did with the quantification, and I'm going to move straight to this slide, the previous slides just build to it, was the relationship between the discussion disciplines and those outcomes. We sorted the individual conversations by their outcomes. So you can see here that there were 7 different conversations and there were outcomes like options generation, intent to act, relationship building. So these are 4 panels sorted by the discussion disciplines, which had significant impact. So integrity Q, which was questions, seemed to be correlated with the creation of options. Courtesy appeared to be associated with relationship building. Inclusion, which was acknowledging individuals, appeared to be related to the intent to act. Why this is particularly interesting is, if you recall, while we were talking earlier about the various different research backgrounds, one was psychology. People are more likely to make commitments to the extent that they're being observed. And in this case, we found that when people were acknowledged as individuals, they were more likely to say something like, I will. Or if they witness it vicariously, they might say, we will, or I will, even though another person was directed. Last but not least, we discovered that the more translation, the more likely there were options generated by the group, such as maybe we should change the species or add species, or maybe we should relocate the lease, or maybe we should have some gathering at a future date. So these are interesting for you, and I would hope that if you've got a pen, write them down, because we're going to be hearing about them again. Questions relate to options. Also, translation relates to options. Courtesy relates to resilience and relationships. And inclusion relates to an intent to act. Another word for inclusion is acknowledgement.
然后当时我们的研究就是还有一项就是重要的结果，就是我们发现就对话的就是刚刚的那个3个对话成果，它跟这个讨论原则是息息相关的。然后我们也就是针对这个对话中，然后这个讨论原则的占比，然后做了一个分析，像这张 PPT 上面的4张图，然后我们就发现就是真诚询问，然后跟这个形成选项是有很大关系的。然后呢，这个礼貌原则跟这个人与人建立关系也有很大的这个关联。然后包容呢是也意味着这个认可，然后能够有助于促进这个个人的行动意图。 然后最后呢，这个整合原则，然后也有助于就是大家形成一个选项，比如说最后的整合原则，然后比如说我们要对那个物种，然后比如说我们要对物种进行一些变化，然后我们要比如说把这个农场的地点，然后给它迁移到其他地方去。那这里比较有意思的一点，我们大家看一下，就是真诚 Q 真诚 Q， 然后与这个整合原则这两个，它是与形成选项有关系的。这两个都就是你在对话当中，如果采用了真诚询问的原则和整合原则的话，是有助于就是你形成选项，然后就是形成这个行动的方案。然后礼貌呢是有助于你们就是建立更好的关系的，然后大家的包容对双方的认可都有助于就是促成你做出行动的意愿。
Thank you, Icy. So I have two other observations before we go and talk about two applications for this, both the qualitative and quantitative. One is that we found out that relationships appeared to increase to the extent that there was tension at the beginning that had been resolved. Recall the work of Otto Scharmer, who often described that if a group worked through a tension, they were more likely to be able to reach a level of flow or creativity. Similarly, we found that the earlier the pivotal juncture, the earlier the translation, the more likely you were to see relationship building. So you can see here in a early pivot in the first 35% of the discussion, there was relationship building, 32 37s. These are all examples of conversations for which relationship building occurred, and there was tension at the beginning that had been resolved. Conversely, where the tension occurred later in the conversation, there was less time to build relationships, it appeared, and you had a greater likelihood of an outcome of the intent to act.
然后我们也发现，就是比较有意思的地方，就是在前面的对话，就对话的初期，因为对话初期可能相对就是关系比较紧张，然后那个时候呢，就是更多的就是这个对话重点其实是在于建立关系，因为或者说能够建立良好的关系的话，就是更有助于这个成果的产生。所以在早期的时候，比如说你越能够更早的去整合、去总结的话，就越有助于关系的建立。然后到后面就是到后面慢慢的，因为在建立了良好的关系的基础上，大家的对话就慢慢的开始就是偏向这个行动意图，然后大家有了这个行动意图的产生。
Thank you, Icy. So you're probably not surprised that women were more likely to inject positivity. So with respect to asking questions, including others, or specifically acknowledging others and using courtesy, women did that disproportionately more. While there were fewer statements by women, women were more likely to use those three discussion disciplines.
然后我们是基于性别的基础，然后也同时对这个对话原则进行了研究。我们发现女性在对话中，就是在积极性方面的贡献是更高的。他们在对话中，就是比如说会更真诚的去向对方询问，然后包容度呢也更高，就是更容易认可别人，同时他们的礼貌程度也比较高。那就是我们发现女性就是在真诚提问，然后包容、礼貌上，就是用的这三个原则是比较多的。
Thank you, Icy. So as you can see, we got through this initial part of the research, and it was really intriguing. We understood that women were more likely to contribute this positivity, and we realized that there were specific outcomes associated with those elements of positivity. But we really didn't know if it was just simply the presence of women or it was the acts and the words themselves. So we did two subsequent pieces of research. One piece of research was looking at an intact team who were developing strategy. We also stayed in the aquaculture industry because there might have been some related things to look at. The second piece was we ingested all of those conversations into a neural net, and we were able to do statistical analysis after using very large volumes of open source data. In the interest of time, I'm going to be very brief through the team analysis, the team conversation analysis, and try to spend a little bit more time talking about the quantitative research. So we looked at an organization called the Maine Aquaculture Hub. That is a nonprofit that is focused on bringing people together for education, for reports, and for disseminating grants about aquaculture.
然后刚才我们对就是男性和女性在对话中讨论原则这个问题，就我们除了发现，就是我们发现，因为女性她在对话中积极性偏高，然后当时我们也就是产生了这样的疑问：是到底是什么促使他们是有这样的结果的？是比如说是他们的行动，还是他们的话语？所以在就是基于刚才的基础上了，然后我们也做了其他的研究，比如说团队在制定战略的时候。就对他们这个制定战略的时候也进行了一个对话编码分析，同时我们也启用了这个就是 AI 上面，比如说这个神经元网络，然后进行数据分析，然后也利用了很多的这个开源语料，也来一起做研究分析。那现在我们来看一下，就是针对这个团队的它的这个战略对话分析。然后这里我们是以缅因州的水产养殖中心为例，这个呢是非营利组织，然后它呢当时也是在这个全州范围内，就是想促进大家的合作，然后提高沟通效率，同时也就是利用各种资源和技能，然后提升整个州，然后这个水产养殖业的创新，然后他们的和谐多元化以及劳动力的发展能力。
Thank you. I see. So we had several conversations that were recorded and transcribed. And we coded them just as we had the lease scoping meetings, the community meetings. And you can see in this example, the group had two different major conversations about strategy. How will we decide in what niche we're going to act and what will be the specific products that we'll be offering? And you can see here that in the first conversation, there were somewhat over-indexed questions and summaries, if you will, with integrity Q and translation. Thankfully, very little snarky. But in the second conversation, you'll see that there is more relationship building. There's more of the conversation's positivity that resulted in clearly a resilience among the team. What was fascinating was that there was less inclusion. There was less individual acknowledgement. And we were interested to see that if that correlates with intent to act, was there some risk there that people would delay in the engagement with the strategic choices?
然后我们就是对这些战略对话进行编码分析以后，我们也发现了就是非常有意思的这个结果。然后当时的对话呢，我们分成了2类，就是第一类是战略启动，然后第2类呢是选项评估，就是大家决定，比如说要提供什么样的产品。然后对第一类对话，我们分析的时候发现，就是对话中的就是这个无论是这个陈述，无论是这个提问，就是提问回答呢，就是真诚的占比真诚的原则的占比还是比较高的。然后呢，就是在这个整合部分呢也是比较高的。但比较有意思的是，然后就是相对就是对立的一面呢是比较少。然后在对话就是选项评估这部分对话的时候呢，在真诚就是询问以及包括礼貌方面，还有是整合形成选项方面，其实大家都还做得比较好，因为这个呢是更有助于建立这个关系，然后大家呢也相对更积极。但是比较少的就是包容性这个减少了，就是对他人的认可度比较低。那这个其实对就是这个团队做出战略决策，其实是会就是形成了一定的阻碍。
Thank you, Icy. So maybe it's not just the conversation, it's where the conversation hooks into strategy. With this subsequent slide, you can see that there is a relationship between the conversation discussion disciplines and elements of strategic thinking. Many of you recall that the researchers who were building on the organizational learning practices in the 90s were often thinking about how do we bring systems thinking and organizational learning into strategy. So you can see that these 5 strategic thinking practices have a lot in common with our conversation discussion disciplines. We found that even though not every utterance was a strategic thinking practice, there were relationships among them. For example, you can see that thinking in time, which is about imagining historical practices or even peer organizations, being respectful of others who have gone before or who might be case studies, is similar to courtesy. Courtesy is about respect. It's about looking at something and giving it the due course of its origins and not condemning it. Similarly, you'll notice that having a systems perspective, being able to see interdependencies, is similar to inclusion. It's about being acknowledging of difference. So I'm going to give that over to you.
然后我们还发现，就是这个对话讨论原则，它与这个战略思考的这个要素是息息相关的。就比如说，我们就是因为很多组织，它就是比如说想把这个他们的这个系统思维啊，以及组织学习啊，都融入到他们的战略。那他们其实就可以去思考他们的这个战略思维跟这个对话原则是有很大的关系的。虽然并不是每一个话，每人的每一句话都是战略性思考，但是他们也是相关的。比如说这个事实思考，这个呢就是跟礼貌是相关的，因为在思考的部分的时候呢，你也是有大家就是相互给予尊重，然后呢也体现了这个礼貌的原则。再比如说大家在做系统视角，就是有战略思维的时候，然后你进行这个从系统视角来考虑，那这个呢也是比如说大家相互之间就是包容，然后也相互依赖，就是然后相互之间就是对，然后也认可我们相互之间的差异，和相互包括最后我们就是机会主义。机会主义的时候是你能够去自己能够发现这个优势，也就是你发现了这个重要的点，然后把它整合出来，然后在这个组织团队里使用。再包括我们这个意图聚焦，因为大家做战略思考的时候都会涉及到你的使命意图，在这个时候呢就涉及到你要真实的去陈述，就是你的宣言是怎样的。然后包括我们就是在有时候一定要具备这个想象力，因为想象力的时候它就跟你的好奇很有关系了。你的好奇的时候，你就会去真诚的提问，你会就是包容就是别人的任何的这个提问，然后而不是说就是有时候比如说不礼貌的时候，比如说是谴责对方的话，而是要去给予对方去尊重、包容、真诚。
Thank you, Icy. So not to spend too much time on the data, but just to give you a sense of what we were observing, the systems perspective was something that kicked us off in the first conversation. There was quite a bit of inclusion going on. And you can see that the first conversation culminated in inquiry, a hypothesis. So we were able to see how the conversation directly contributed to a setup. Then in the second conversation with the strategy team, we ended up with a conclusion, a sort of expansion of one's current capabilities. In their case, what were some of the things that nonprofit was particularly successful doing, like being a network, like educating. They turned those capabilities into opportunity. You'll notice too, as I mentioned before, that there was less systems perspective relative to the benchmark, right, to those lease scoping meetings. However, the beauty here is that you can see while the systems perspective was early on in the first conversation, it was later in the second conversation. That might mean that there was more directed activity or conversation towards an intent to act. Though you can see that number is relatively small relative to simply saying, oh, this is what we're good at.
那我们就是后来对这个就是战略启动对话和选项评估，然后又就是基于这个战略思维原则，然后也进行了一个评估。就我们就发现，比如说刚开始对话的时候呢，这个系统思维、系统视角就是相对而言比较少的。然后大家呢也有一定程度的这个假设驱动，因为是在就是最开始设定这个战略要启动的时候，然后比重相对比较高的呢就是机会主义，因为那个时候呢大家其实更容易的去想去看到更多的机会，然后也同时也有一定程度的就是聚焦，就是大家的意图，聚焦这个我们要做的事情，我们的使命，然后再就是进行到这个选项评估这个对话的时候，我们看到这个就是包容的程度呢其实是比较高的，因为比如说大家看这个事实思考，然后这里然后也是就是比较高的，然后系统视角就包容啊，这个尊重，然后是程度是比较高的，因为大家就是在经过前面的就是一段就是对话经历以后，然后到了后面啊，这里呢同时也是就是在这里，然后我们看到前面系统视角刚开始会比较少一点，然后到后面的比重就是慢慢增加了，因为大家就是相对的就是看到了机会以后，然后呢也同时能够从就是多角度更全面的去来思考这个问题，然后能够看到更多的机会，就是如何比如说看到机会，然后这样的话我们能够促进我们就是这个行动的意图。
Thank you, I see. So I'm going to just give you a conclusion. Now we've had an interesting experience of communities coming together who do not necessarily know each other in a conversation about conflict. And then we had an example of a team coming together, really doubling down and trying to figure out what the strategy should be for the organization. And these are some of the higher lessons learned. One is that the patterns of discussion disciplines do matter, especially inclusion if the goal is to move towards action, because inclusion relates to the intent to act. We also found that strategic thinking is an important place where one should be studying conversation practices. And in a longer conversation with you, I may be able to help you figure out ways to diagnose risks when those conversations do or do not contain those specific discussion disciplines. It also turns out that sequence matters. So if there are earlier pivots, there is a higher likelihood of relationship building. That's something to pay attention to. That's not to say you should force a pivot. It's just to say, pay attention to the degree to which there is resolution of conflict if your goal is to build a resilient team. We did not talk about indirect speech, but one of the things that I observed in many of these conversations, in particular where individuals came in as a coalition to oppose the lease, they often would use sarcasm or they would bring in references to things outside of the meeting that weren't always evident to everybody in there. We call that indirect speech. Then the context matters as well. Everybody knows that you can't get everything from the words. There's body language, there's facial expression, there's cadence, there's pitch. There are many different things that are going on. It's important for us to know the context is something that has its own role. For example, before the meeting, there might be ways that people reach out to each other. They might signal that they're going to have a positive interaction, say by making an invitation or checking in. We also saw that when there are different balances of men and women, for example, if there are more men, you might be less likely to get some of those inclusion, courtesy, and integrity Q statements. And interestingly enough, in my experience with these with these conversations, networks weren't always the most productive. Sometimes the networks were oppositional, in which case they brought in indirect speech or they went through a script to oppose the leasing process, not necessarily engaging in the discussion disciplines for the intent of creating actions.
然后呢，我们还就是针对这个对这个团体的对话和团队的对话，我们还发生了就是其他的见解，特别是说这些人他们刚开始是互相不认识的，然后呢就是大家如何通过对话然后解决这个冲突。那首先我们看一下，比如说他们这个对话里有一些特征，首先就是比如说讨论是原则里面，比如说特别是包容比较突出的。因为比如说很多组织里它的一个目标就是能够促成行动，而这个包容它对这个促成行动就是行动意图是紧密相关的。第二个就是战略思维，就是大家不断的进行这个对话练习，其实是有助于你去发现，比如说我们目前团队里产生的可能遇到的一些风险，然后比如说哪些是我们应该做的，而哪些是我们就是不应该做的，或者我们做了哪些又没有做哪些事情。第三个是就是关于这个序列，我们刚才说这个就是注意一下这个对话的一些就是关键点，比如说刚开始的时候我们更多的把这个对话的这个重点是放在这个建立关系上的，因为你首先要解决一下就是可能存在的这个冲突问题。那第四个特征是就是关于这个间接语言的问题，因为有的人我们发现有的人在对话过程当中他可能会用一些就是不太礼貌，他可能会用一些比较讽刺性的话语，然后或者是讨论一些跟这个会议就是不相关的内容。然后这个就是这些对话呢，其实它本身呢也就是暗含着一定的背景，这是很重要的。比如说第一个信号传递，这个信号传递就是通过人你的身体语言，你的表情，然后通过你的语音语调，你的这个可能抑扬顿挫，然后在对话过程当中给别人传递了什么样的信息。那比如说就是每次比如说开会，然后会议之前大家可能就是因为比如说简单的闲聊一下，然后就是熟悉一下，相互就是进行一个简单的互动，然后在这个互动过程中，比如说可能简单的闲谈，或者说你就是在有意识或无意识情况下去就是模仿对方的这个可能表情啊或者动作，然后跟对方拉近距离这样。然后第二个就是在性别差异方面，就是男女差异，因为我们就是发现就是在男性他是在对话过程当中这个包容原则、礼貌原则、这个真诚原则这个占比相对是比较低的，是要低于这个女性的。那基于我个人的经验而言呢，这个对话呢确实它是有助于促进就是我们的这个社交网络的，然后它是有助于就是提升这个团队的就是比如说工作效率等等。然后因为大家就是在社交网络当中的对话呢，就是我们更多的倾向于就是大家要就是真诚直接的对话，因为这样的话那么你就是更有助于我们行动，就是我们的下一步行动。
Thank you, Icy. So I'm going to just quickly go through the quantitative analysis, and then we're going to take a break and we're going to have questions.
好，现在我们呢暂时就是休息一会儿，然后
Thank you.
休息完了，然后我们再继续进行分享。
Good. So as I mentioned, we had 3 parts to this research. One was to explore the impact on the outcomes of conversation where it was a spontaneous community coming together with a pretty thorny problem, which was this sustainability conflict around aquaculture. And the second one was to look at an intact team. The quantitative analysis involved using the coded conversations from those community conversations to train a neural net. Originally, we thought we might use a number of different types of processes. We started using something called the term frequency, indirect document frequency, which is like SEO, search engine optimization. That had a relatively poor performance when we used the trained least scoping meeting conversation documents as a validator. Next we did was word embeddings, which was a basic neural net. Again, not that high performance. As you probably remember, the word-to-vec word embeddings was a basic neural net without transfer learning. Then we used BERT, which is Google's open source machine learning algorithm or application, which is called bidirectional encoding representations from transformers. That not only is a neural net using backpropagation in a number of different layers, but it also uses transfer learning. It uses intelligence around conversation from Google as well as Wikipedia.
刚才就是我们分别就是最开始的时候，我们对这个缅因州水产养殖团体的对话，然后进行了分析，就是分析了这个团体，然后在面临问题的时候是如何通过对话来解决这个问题、解决冲突的。然后再后来第二个，我们就是通过了这个团队的这个战略对话，然后对此进行了这个定量的研究，我们对这个话语语料进行了编码分析，然后再接着呢，我们就是通过这个就是人工智能，然后机器学习的模型，也同样对这个对话进行了分析。那当时我们主要是采用了3种方法，这3个模型呢，分别是这个术语频率、间接文档频率，然后第二个是词语嵌入，它是基础神经网，第3个模型是谷歌的 BERT 神经网络，这个神经网络它就采用了就是开源语料，然后通过机器学习，然后也使用了编码，同时也就涉及到比如说人的各种智能这方面。然后这个第3个，我们经过研究以后发现这个 BERT 谷歌 BERT 的这个神经网络这个模型，它总体表现是更优的，它是更适用于就是大规模建模的，所以我们最终是采用了这个方法。
In the appendix, you are going to find a lot more detail on this, including various different ways. We appended metadata in order to see if we could improve the performance. In the final analysis, the neural net succeeded. This is an example of the analysis that we did after having this rich model that had been trained on our least scoping meeting conversations. We ingested into the model approximately 30,000 utterances. And in the appendix, you can see those 30,000 utterances represented approximately 600 conversations. Then we did what's called a binary logistic regression. That is, we regressed the outcomes of intent to act, relationship building, and options generation on coded conversations from a massive open source repository that we generated from Reddit and from movie transcripts and from other places. And those were the 30,000 records. And as you can see, there was a positive, significant relationship between inclusion and intent to act. Other types of relationships are being analyzed now, but at the 95% confidence interval, you can see that a 10% increase in inclusion is associated with a 45% increase in the likelihood that there was an intent to act. And the intent to act, the relationship building, and the options generation were coded in the conversation using lookup, whereas the discussion disciplines were coded using the neural net. And that was because of the volume of conversations. We didn't have enough training data with only 750 utterances and far fewer outcomes. We didn't have enough training data to use a neural net for the coding of outcomes.
然后呢，我们就是后来就是关于这个神经元的这个具体的这个分析，大家其实在后面的目录呢是可以看到，然后大家就是可以在就是后面我们把这个 PPT 提供给大家，大家可以仔细的看。然后就是通过我们当时呢，就是对就是我们这个对话进行编码以后，然后最后形成了大概有3万个就是开放源语料，然后我们对这些开放源语料进行了测试，然后还对就是它的这个成果，就是这个对话成果，比如说这个行动意图、关系建立、生成选项，然后进行了回归分析。然后进行回归分析以后呢，我们就是发现这个包容与行动意图是有很大的关系的。因为我们包容度每增加10个百分点，那么行动意图的几率呢会增加15%。我们当时还启用了各种，比如说
但是我们预约不清也。
对啊，是男女。
谷歌里我们还用了各种就是搜索的这个功能，然后对比如说它的神经元还有各种讨论原则进行了分析，得出了这个结论。那具体的话，大家可以就是拿这个 PPT， 然后再仔细的看一下。
你抢到了没？
Sorry, we're getting a little bit of background noise. If you aren't muted, please mute yourself.
你不是给我下了鲨鱼裤吗？我的鲨鱼裤有呀，搁哪儿呢？哪儿呢？本人的鲨鱼。
So there's a lot more behind all of this. And we have provided in the appendix the gruesome detail. Why not? It's Halloween. We can call it gruesome detail about how we tested the different models, ingested all the open source data, did the statistical analysis, and came to a number of conclusions. But suffice it to say, we were able to show that there are significant relationships between that inclusion or acknowledgement and the intent to act, between courtesy and the relationship building, and between translation and options generation, which gives us a signal as we're trying to do tacit knowledge transfer. We're trying to create knowledge together, and we're trying to help move knowledge into action. Here are the kind of grand conclusions I leave you with. However, we will take a break and then come back for conversation. So none of this is really over. We invite you to be part of the research. So we recommend that you nurture and you spread conversation skills within your networks, whether it's your existing networks or new networks. We recommend that you work with your teams to master the discussion disciplines. Maybe as a facilitator, you undertake responsibility to inject discussion disciplines when you sense that they are underrepresented. Also, watch for the pivot timing, watch for turn taking, watch for different things that occur in the sequence of the conversation. Establish psychological safety. That is specifically do what needs to be done in order to build openness, inquiry, curiosity, as opposed to isolation and defensiveness and indirect speech. Notice that there are gender patterns or status patterns. The status of individuals may translate into the degree to which they use inclusion, or they use courtesy, or they use integrity Q. If you are the leader, recognize your own habits. Also, make conversation practices discussable. Know that they have an impact for teams, they have an impact for communities, and they have an impact for society. In the research that we undertook, we saw that conversation can have a genuine impact on sustainability.
我们在就是对采用了不同的模型进行研究以后呢，因为我们都得出了一个就是相同的结论，就是这个结论呢是非常显著的，就是这个包容，然后对行动意图是能带来很大影响的。然后同时这个礼貌它有助于关系的建立，然后这个整合总结它是有助于 帮助大家生成这个选项。那同时这个呢也是对我来说也是一个信号，就是我们在组织里在团队里，然后通过这个对话原则，采用这个对话原则是有助于大家进行隐性知识的分享转移的，也有助于大家共同去创造知识，然后去采取这个知识相关的行动。然后现在我们就是得出一些结论，然后这个结论呢，比如说有几个结论，第一个就是在网络中，这个网络呢就是我们的比如说公司网络或者社交网络，你可能是现在的或者是新建立的，就是在网络中你要培养和传播这个对话技巧，就是在一个团队里，就是要有你如果当发现就是某一个人他在这个比如说表现方面，在业绩方面他好像做的不太好，那么你是有这个责任，然后去通过这个对话原则，然后来就是提升他的这个能动性的。那第二个是你要我们要能够掌握这个讨论原则，同时也了解到这个讨论原则对我们来带来的这个好的积极的影响。三个就是在对话过程当中一定要注意这个关键的时机，因为这个关键的时机呢也是就是比如说在哪个时刻然后进行一个话轮转换，比如说我们前面那个港务局长他就是有一个话语，然后那个当时呢他遇到了一个就是出现了一个情绪波动，其实那就是也是一个就是话语转换的一个重要时机。第四个呢是建立一个心理安全，这个心理安全呢，比如说让人在这个环境里他能够比如说比较开放的，然后能够积极的去提问，他能够保持好奇心。那如果说他感到不那么安全的话，他可能就是说话的时候他可能不太就是愿意去表达自己的观点，或者说话语的时候就是可能会比较迂回。第四个就是可以去关注一下这个性别这个地位的模式，因为我们刚才提到女性在对话中她采用包容原则、礼貌原则、真诚原则的比例是比较高的。那作为领导者，其实你也可以特别关注一下自己在这方面的这个习惯倾向。最后呢，是我们就是对话呢一定要遵循这个，尽量的让你们这个对话遵循这个讨论原则，因为这个讨论原则它不只对就是团队，然后对整个比如说团体啊，包括整个社会，其实都是可以带来积极的影响，而且这种影响是可持续的。
Thank you, IC. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I wanted to just check in with Fisher. Fisher, do you want us still to take a break? It feels like there have been a lot of breaks, certainly for me, because I don't speak Chinese, and I got to enjoy listening to IC, but relaxing.
Thank you, Katrina. So maybe in this case, since
Thank you, IC. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I wanted to just check in with Fisher. Fisher, do you want us still to take a break? It feels like there have been a lot of breaks, certainly for me, because I don't speak Chinese, and I got to enjoy listening to IC, but relaxing.
Thank you, Katrina. So maybe in this case, since I don't know how long it will take additionally. So
I'm done. We're now moving into questions.
Okay, so in that case, let's go ahead with the questions.
Great, thank you, everybody. So grateful that you all participated, and we are live streaming as well. So there may be questions coming from a variety of different places.
Exactly.
非常感谢大家就是的线上热情的参与，然后大家如果现在有什么问题的话，可以提问。
Hi, Doctor. This is Michelle. I have a question, basically regarding about the local culture. How's the local culture impact the 5 discussion principles? Do you have any insight on this or research on that? Because I see this is great for the company, but locally, like our company is a global company, some exercise basically in certain country, especially in Asia Pacific, like Japan, China, and several others, may a little bit different from what we saw the result in other, like the European country or the American. part.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. That is such a great question.
就是有个问题，就是比如说对地方的我们的文化是否对这个5个讨论原则是否有影响？因为我们知道就是不同的地方它的文化不一样，然后对就产生的结果也不一样。比如说就是亚太地区，像日本和中国的情况就跟欧美国家也有点不同，所以我想知道就是一个国家或地区的文化对这个讨论原则的影响。
Thank you. Michelle, that is such a good question. While I was presenting this material to other academics, the first thing they said was, what about our indigenous populations, right? What are their different uses of these discussion disciplines? There will be different baselines, and you'll be creating a benchmark based on your own culture. And we can tell that there are differences in cultures that are highly status oriented. So, for example, in highly status oriented cultures, there is generally less crosstalk. There is oftentimes talk going directly to the person who is convening the meeting. It'll be important for the convener of the meeting to be vulnerable and to let others know that they're going to role model things like courtesy and inclusion. Even Integrity Q, which does take some kind of vulnerability, because that would represent them as somebody who's asking, not just stating. So there are differences in culture, but the relationships between the discussion disciplines and the outcomes are persistent. The research that stood behind our work is very consistent. I should mention there are 2 pieces of research that I alluded to but didn't go into detail that are worth keeping in mind. One is research on crisis hotlines. To the extent that people interact with matching language in crisis hotlines, the person who is responding and the person who's coming onto the hotline, matching language, which is like inclusion, the higher the likelihood that the individual who's coming with the crisis gets to closure. And there's really fascinating, statistically significant relationships going on there. The second piece of research that's really compelling and that really stood behind our work was by actually one of my doctoral advisors, Erez Yoli and David Rand. And that shows that to the extent that people are visible while they're making a declaration of, doing something pro-social, like they're going to recycle, they are more likely to recycle to the extent that they are visible, to the extent that their name is on a list or that they have been acknowledged by others in the group. So those are examples of types of research that show there are relationships here, regardless of the existing patterns in our system. Your question's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. It's very helpful. And somehow, and when you really apply this this practice, I think need to integrate some local, highly recognized, behaviors. Thank you.
And when you get the slides, make a version of it for yourself. In the back, you'll see I've given some examples of language, and you do the same. In fact, you could even put in jokes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Can I say that was actually?
Oh, IC's going to translate. Then Christine.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. 就因为在我之前就是分享这些话题的时候呢，当时大家就也有就是提问，比如说这些讨论原则该如何使用，以及对于就是原住人就是相不同的人，这些就是不同文化的人，他又然后就是带来什么样的影响？其实因为像这个对话原则，其实基于不同的文化，它又有就是一个不同的基准。比如说在有一些比如说比较注重就是地位等级的这些国家，然后他们就是交流的时候呢，很少有那种就是相互的，因为更多的是可能是一方向另一方的直接的指令式的对话。那因为确实在不同的这个文化里面呢，这个跟这个对讨论原则确实是他们之间确实是有关联的。我也做过就是2个研究，比如说其中一个研究就是我就是遇到的就是我女儿的她的一个比如说教学顾问吧， 然后就发现有的人呢，他其实在就是对话中，他更多的其实比较在意自己，就是在意自己的一个就是能被就是更多人看到，就是自己的一个比如说存在感吧，因为他愿意就是希望自己能够就是更多的得到别人的认可。那还有一些人也是就是在就是两个人因为是可能处于就是不同的什么逻辑背景下，然后他们之间相互对话的时候呢，就是有一个就是匹配的问题，能够就是比如相互能够关联，但有的人呢，他就是能够更好的就是对话的时候能够更好的 get 到对方的点，但有的人就是相对就是不那么容易。所以说我们就是不同的像这种就是人的一个就可能存在模式一个文化呢，就确实对这个讨论原则就是也会有带来不同的影响。
Thank you, I see. Christine, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, Michelle, I picked up on the same thing because in what I snagged on was the idea that gender is sort of a cultural issue or construct. And so I think it's interesting, Kate, that you talk about there are actually sort of meta concepts that feed into what we think in terms of, you know, we think of associate with certain, you know, gender roles, right? And so I think if I'm understanding you right, what you're saying is it's less about having a male-female balance and maybe more about having folks in the room that share traditionally attributes that are traditionally associated with one gender or another. So less about your biological gender and more about, from a cultural perspective, what it is that makes you feminine or masculine, and having a balance of that in the room seems to be the thing that helps to increase integrity and so outcomes. Does that sound about right?
Yeah. The research I pointed out to you is also on that slide. The research shows that the more social sensitivity there is in the conversation, which has traditionally been collinear with females in the conversation, the more social sensitivity, the higher the likelihood that the conversation leads to outcomes. And they also see that across conversations in teams who are existing together over time. And the specific outcomes that I saw were the intent to act and the relationship building.
And if I understood you right, it was the same with the teams that were not intact as it was with the teams that were intact?
Yes.
Got it. Okay, good. Thank you.
因为刚才就是我们之前也提到，就是团队对话当中，就是这个性别差异，就是男性跟女性在对话中提出的讨论原则差异。然后此外，其实还有一点就是不止这个性别差异，还有一个就是因为可能比如说跟文化相关的，还有一个就是人际触觉，大家就是在社交场合的这个敏感度。那这个呢，也对这个对话的成果也是有影响的。就你的比如说你的人际触觉越高，那么你这个对话的成果就越好。
Thank you, Icy. And Larissa, thank you for broaching that question. I was pleased that you did it, and certainly you inspired Christine as well.
As here are two questions from the audience. Yes, the first question is about the strategy initiation and the options generation. Are they the first stage and the second stage, before and after? The first stage is the stage initiation, and the second stage is the option generation. Is the understanding right?
So the question was, is there a relationship between the balance of the discussion disciplines and the stage that the group is in with a strategy cycle? Is that what the question was?
It's just the sequence, the before and after. The first is the first stage and the second stage.
So I maybe the question is simpler than I thought. So yes. In the first conversation, they were trying to make sure that they kind of put everything out there. So they really had the desire to generate options. They didn't want to get to closure until they had come together around a variety of different possibilities. So they could become different funding models, or they could operate as a different type of organizational structure. So that was the intent of the strategy initiation. In the options evaluation, they were narrowing it. Their goal was at that point to make a decision. And if you look at the numbers there, the good news is that there was a move more towards evaluating those hypotheses and sort of moving those hypotheses into actions. And you also saw that they were more likely to, well, they were persistently likely to look at their own strengths, turn their strengths into opportunity.
是的，这个先是那个战略启动，然后呢是这个选项评估。在战略启动方面，这个阶段你就是把所有的问题就是都摆在桌面上，因为你一定要首先就是把这个所有问题上摆在桌面上，就是你明确了这样一个方向，因为后面呢你才有这个就是意愿去就是下一步去做行动。那后面就是第二个是在这个选项评估阶段是把这个范围就缩小了，因为在这个阶段呢你要去做一个决策了，因为你的要开始做一个，比如说你可以做一些假设或者做一些评估，然后呢也可以做一些比如说利弊分析，对自己的优势劣势进行分析，因为这个优势分析呢，你的优势因为可以是转化为机遇的，所以确实是这两个阶段确实是前后的顺序。
Thank you. I see. Any other questions? One thing I would say just in that question there was that there was good reason to be optimistic because there was more of a systems perspective later in the conversation, in the second conversation. It was as if they were looking more widely, looking at the diversity as the diversity would be undertaking action. Having made decisions, they were looking back out at the larger system in which they would act. But it ended with them talking about themselves, which was exactly what we would have expected. It ended with them saying, we are good at X and we're going to pursue it because we've deliberated.
也是我们刚才就是在里面提到了一个，就是战略思维里有一个比较系统全面的视角。所以像比如说在这个选项评估阶段，你能够就是比较全面的，然后更多元的去，然后看待这个行动的时候呢，是有助于你就是更就是清晰的了解你这个决策就是否就是可以采用。那在最后的时候呢，我们也是就是对自己就是进行自己就是团队内进行一个对话，因为你们就是刚才你们做的这个启动，你们做的选项评估，其实都是你们经过深思熟虑的，然后是你们的对话呢是促成了你们这个成果的产生的。
I think we're running out of time.
Also, the question about.
Do you have one more question? Yes. Let's see, Fisher. Do you need to make it?
Yes, the question asked by the same person, and also about the strategy initiation and option evaluation. The person asked, as the two stages happen in one program and they are engaged by the same group of people.
Yes.
Yes, 是的，这个答案是是的。这两个阶段是确实是一个项目的两个阶段，然后也是同一批人在做的。
Great. So due to this time limit, we may stop here. So I mean, thank you, Kat, for your wonderful sharing. I really learned a lot. I'm sure everyone in the team also learned a lot. Thank you very much again. 那 OK。那接下来呢 ？OK，so after that we do the little bit introduction to the team of our board forums in mid of December, and then try to see more and more people will join us in December for this the first global organizational Tacit Knowledge Management Forum over there. So that the date is December 17 and 18. Of course, we will broadcast in both English and Chinese globally. To the audience. So let me try to share something to our audience here in Chinese, so everyone will see. Just to get some feedback. Okay. So 那这样好，这就像刚才讲的，我们今年12月17号、18号呢，会在博鳌举办全球首届组织隐形技能管理论坛。那么这个论坛呢，我们预计呢会在线，预计全球会有200万人在线。那线下呢会有差不多只能局限在200人左右，线下的200人，线上我们是200万人。那这次活动呢是由海来人才集团、蒙科以及组织隐形技能管理全球智库3个单位联合承办。那么在这个活动中间，我们会邀请到一批财富500强的全球 CEO， 目前有几家那个大的全球 CEO 的这个我们这些就正在逐步的去确认。那么还有一些国际组织的代表，包括中国大学、知名大学的校长代表，那么他们呢，还以及大的企业的董事长、CEO， 他们呢都会做我们的演讲嘉宾来进行，就是说参会。总共呢应该会有近80名左右的各类专家来做演讲，也就是总共我们可能会有演讲嘉宾，应该总共会有80名左右，是这么概念。那么它的话题会分成4大块：总纲、萃取篇、传承篇以及职业篇，会分成这四大块。那么呢，我这个活动呢，那么如果大家想去获得这个票子，你可以去提前去买那个早鸟票。那早鸟票你就扫码去获得这个早鸟票。那这个早鸟票呢，它的原价呢应该是它的票价呢应该是全价是999块钱一个人。那么最终呢，我们现在可能会有早鸟票，早鸟票呢就是差不多每过10天左右吧，早鸟票呢就是价格优惠部分呢可能就会少了100块钱，所以你呢越早呢会越合算一点啊。那么最后呢，我想就是说感谢一下大家的时间，那么呢，对我们本次论坛做一个反馈，希望你呢扫码给我们做一个问卷，给我们填一个简单的问卷。那这个问卷呢可以帮助我们未来呢可以做得更好，好吗？所以呢，希望你呢就花一点时间，拿出你的手机扫一下这个二维码，给我们一些反馈。那么这些反馈呢，我们每次都会非常很重视大家的反馈情况，所以我们也会把大家所有的反馈情况呢尽可能的体现在我们下一次的讲座里面去，好吗？下一期也就是说是我们的第11期，是我们50场讲座的第11期。那下次讲座是11月10号晚上7点半到21点，11月10号的晚上7点半到21点啊。它是由我们在新加坡的一个专家，也是知识管理协会的下一任的主席，也是知识管理协会的副会长 Face 先生，他给大家去分享啊。如果大家有兴趣的，可以提前去报名，就扫码报名参加我们这个活动。同时呢，你也可以在你的日历上面把这个时间呢给记下来。欢迎大家呢关注我们的这个项目啊。那最后呢，我想非常诚挚的邀请各位朋友把我们的系列讲座呢分享给你身边的朋友。我们中国有句古话叫做送人玫瑰，手有余香。我们要拯救组织隐形技能，助人振兴企业和强国。那推动组织隐形技能萃取和传承在中国乃至于在全球的发展，造福社会。我们不仅要倡议拯救组织隐形技能，还要去研究组织隐形技能萃取、传承和管理的方法，更重要的是在全社会普及。那么让我们一起来共同努力，共同去开启组织隐形技能管理的新篇章，让更多的人去受益，好吗？好，那最后呢，再次感谢大家参与，让我们的11月10号晚上同一时间再见。OK， 好。Okay, so in this case, thank you very much, Kat, for your wonderful sharing today, and thank you, Christine, and everyone for your participation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a
Bye-bye.
good day.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Bye bye.